My daughter looked me dead in the eye in front of 300 guests and said, "Please, just don't talk to anyone tonight. You're an embarrassment to this family." She said it with a smile on her face, so the cameras wouldn't catch what she really meant. I nodded, stepped back into the shadow of the tent, and let her walk away in her $40,000 gown. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the estate she was getting married on, the one with the marble fountains and the 600 acres of vineyard, had my name on the deed. And by midnight, her new mother-in-law was going to find that out before I said a single word. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. And if a story about being underestimated by your own blood has ever hit close to home, stay with me, because this one isn't finished until the very last name is read out loud. My name is Eleanor Voss. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, people have looked right past me. I grew up on a dairy farm outside a small town in Vermont, the kind of place where winters lasted 8 months and everyone wore the same coat for a decade. My father died when I was 12, and my mother raised 3 of us alone by cleaning houses in town. I learned early that quiet people are often mistaken for small people. I never corrected anyone who made that mistake. I just kept working. I married young to a good, quietly. Never flashy, never announced. A commercial lot here, a stretch of coastal property there, a controlling share in a family vineyard in the Finger Lakes that nobody else wanted after a bad frost wiped out 3 seasons of grapes. We restored it slowly, patiently, the way you restore anything worth keeping. By the time Walter passed away 11 years ago, our holding company, which carried his mother's maiden name, Ashford, instead of ours because Walter liked his privacy, owned properties worth more than either of us ever spoke about at the dinner table. My daughter Claire never knew the details. She knew we were comfortable. She assumed comfortable meant modest. Quietly. Never flashy, never announced. A commercial lot here, a stretch of coastal property there, a controlling share in a family vineyard in the Finger Lakes that nobody else wanted after a bad frost wiped out 3 seasons of grapes. We restored it slowly, patiently, the way you restore anything worth keeping. By the time Walter passed away 11 years ago, our holding company, which carried his mother's maiden name, Ashford, instead of ours because Walter liked his privacy, owned properties worth more than either of us ever spoke about at the dinner table. My daughter Claire never knew the details. She knew we were comfortable. She assumed comfortable meant modest. I let her believe that because I wanted her to build her own life without leaning on mine. I wanted her to marry for love, not for a number on a balance sheet. I wanted her to respect people the way you respect them when you don't know what they're worth. I see now that I miscalculated. I gave her privacy instead of truth, and in that gap, she built a version of me that was small enough to be ashamed of. Claire grew up bright, sharp-tongued, and hungry for a life that looked like the magazines she used to cut pictures out of as a teenager. She went to a private university on a partial scholarship I quietly supplemented without telling her the loans she thought she'd taken out barely existed. She majored in marketing, took an internship at a boutique events firm in the city, and within 2 years was managing weddings for people whose names showed up in society columns. She started speaking differently, dressing differently. On her visits home, she'd glance around our house, modest, warm, full of Walter's old woodworking tools and my canning jars, with a look I recognized but didn't want to name. Pity dressed up as tolerance. 2 years ago, she met Julian Ashworth Whitfield III. Yes, that was really his full name, and yes, she said it every time like it was a magic spell. Julian's family owned Whitfield Vineyard Estate, 600 acres of rolling hills, a restored 1800s manor house, a working vineyard, and an event space that hosted weddings for people who paid more for a single evening than most people make in 3 years. Julian's mother, Regina Whitfield, ran the estate like a queen running a small, elegant country. She had a way of looking at you that made you check whether your shoes were clean. When Claire told me she was engaged, she called from her car, not from home, and the first thing she said wasn't, "I'm happy." It was, "Mom, I need you to understand how important this family is. Regina has expectations." I asked what kind of expectations. Claire was quiet for a second and then said, "Just dress conservatively. Don't bring up the farm. Don't tell embarrassing stories about Dad's old truck. And maybe don't mention that you clip coupons. It's not that I'm ashamed. I just want tonight to be perfect." I told her I understood. I did understand. I understood exactly what she was asking me to become for one evening, invisible. I want to be honest with you. It hurt in a way I didn't expect, because I had spent 40 years building something with Walter, so that our daughter would never have to feel small in front of anyone. And here she was, asking me to make myself small so that she wouldn't feel embarrassed in front of people who, frankly, owed their entire evening venue to a business decision I had made a decade before either of them was born. But I said nothing. I packed a simple navy dress, the pearls Walter gave me on our 20th anniversary, and I drove myself to the Whitfield estate 3 hours upstate alone because Claire said the family car only had room for the wedding party. The estate was every bit as beautiful as the photographs. White tents strung with hanging lights, a marble fountain at the center of the courtyard, a vineyard rolling out toward the horizon in perfect green rows. I walked in quietly, found my assigned seat, table 14, near the kitchen entrance, as far from the head table as physically possible without being outside the tent, and I sat down and folded my hands and told myself this evening was about Claire, not about me. For the first hour, it was lovely. I watched my daughter walk down the aisle in someone else's grandmother's veil, since apparently mine wasn't elegant enough, and I cried the way any mother cries watching her child promise herself to someone. I meant every tear. It was during the cocktail hour that things changed. White tents strung with hanging lights, a marble fountain at the center of the courtyard, a vineyard rolling out toward the horizon in perfect green rows. I walked in quietly, found my assigned seat, table 14, near the kitchen entrance, as far from the head table as physically possible without being outside the tent, and I sat down and folded my hands and told myself this evening was about Claire, not about me. For the first hour, it was lovely. I watched my daughter walk down the aisle in in someone else's grandmother's veil, since apparently mine wasn't elegant enough, and I cried the way any mother cries watching her child promise herself to someone. I meant every tear. It was during the cocktail hour that things changed. I smiled and excused myself to find the restroom, and that was when Claire followed me around the corner of the tent, gripping my arm harder than she probably meant to.
"Mom," she whispered, please
just don't talk to anyone tonight. You're an embarrassment to this family." Then she smiled again because 2 guests were walking past, and she said something bright and unbothered to them before turning back to me with the smile gone. "I mean it," she said. "Just enjoy the food and stay near your table." I nodded. I told her I understood, and I meant it. I understood completely for the first time exactly who my daughter had decided to become. I want you to know something about me. I don't raise my voice. I didn't grow up in a house where women raised their voices to be heard. I grew up in a house where women worked quietly and let the results speak when the time was right. So I didn't cry in that moment. I didn't storm off to my car. I walked back into the reception, sat down at table 14 near the kitchen, and I ate my dinner in silence while 300 people toasted a marriage funded, decorated, and hosted on land that I had personally saved from bankruptcy 9 years earlier. Because here's the truth Claire never bothered to ask about. In 2017, the Whitfield family nearly lost this estate. Julian's father, before he passed, had leveraged the property against a series of failed business ventures, a boutique hotel chain that collapsed, an import business that never recovered from a lawsuit. The bank was 18 months from foreclosure. A holding company called Ashford Land Partners quietly purchased the majority note on the property, restructured the debt, and allowed the family to keep operating the estate as tenants with an option to repurchase, provided they met specific benchmarks over 10 years. Ashford Land Partners was Walter's and my company. I had personally approved that acquisition after reading about the family's situation in a regional business journal because Walter had always believed you help people rebuild rather than let land go to strangers who'll strip it for parts. I had never once mentioned this to Claire. Why would I? It was a business matter, finalized years before she ever met Julian. I had no idea, not one clue, that my own daughter's future in-laws were living on land my family quietly held the note to. The toasts went long into the evening. Julian's best man told stories about childhood summers on the estate. Regina gave a toast about legacy, about the importance of marrying into a family that understands what it means to protect what you've built. I remember thinking quietly at my little table near the kitchen how strange it was to sit and listen to a woman speak about protecting a legacy she didn't fully understand the terms of. It was close to 11 o'clock when the estate's property manager, a soft-spoken older man named Harold, who had worked for the Whitfield family for over 20 years, approached the head table with an urgent, apologetic look on his face. I only caught pieces of it from where I sat, but I saw Regina's expression change from polished hostess to something colder, sharper. Harold was holding a folder. I later learned that folder contained something entirely unrelated to me. A routine notice from the county about an upcoming property tax reassessment. Triggered because the 10-year repurchase window on the original note was approaching its deadline in exactly 4 months, and the county required updated ownership documentation before the reassessment could proceed. Harold, doing his job as he always had, needed a signature confirming the current holder of record on the deed of trust before the estate's accountant could file the paperwork Monday morning. Regina excused herself from the head table, visibly irritated at the interruption during her son's wedding, and asked Harold, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Can this not wait until Monday?" Harold, flustered, explained the county deadline was immovable, and he simply needed her to glance at the name on file before he left for the night, since the holding company had never changed its listed contact, and he wanted to confirm it before mailing anything. He opened the folder. Regina looked down at the document. I watched her go still. She looked up, scanned the reception, and I understood exactly what she was doing because I had seen that same look on the faces of bankers and lawyers over the years. The look of someone trying to match a name on a piece of paper to a face in a room. Her eyes moved from table to table until they landed on me, sitting quietly at table 14 in my navy dress and my pearls, and I watched 30 years of assumptions rearrange themselves behind her eyes in real time. She walked over. Not quickly, not with drama, but with the deliberate pace of someone recalculating every interaction from the last 6 hours. She stopped in front of my table and said, "Eleanor Voss." Not a question, a confirmation. I said, "Yes, that's me." She held up the folder slightly, her hand not quite steady. "Ashford Land Partners," she said, "the trust note on this property. It's registered to an Eleanor Ashford Voss." I nodded and told her that was my late husband's family name, the one we used for the holding company, and yes, that was me. The color left her face. She asked, quietly now, almost gently, if I would step aside with her for a moment. I did. We walked to the edge of the courtyard, near the same spot where my daughter had told me I was an embarrassment 3 hours earlier, and Regina Whitfield, in her flawless gown, asked me if I had known. If I had known this whole time that my daughter was marrying into the family living on my land? I told her the truth. I had no idea Claire and Julian's families were connected until this very moment, because I never discussed the holding company's investments with my daughter. I told her Walter and I bought that note 9 years ago to keep a family from losing their home, not to hold it over anyone's head, and that I still had no intention of doing so now. I told her the repurchase option was still valid, still fair, still exactly what we'd agreed to in writing 9 years earlier, and that nothing about tonight changed a single term of that agreement. Regina Whitfield, who 20 minutes earlier had given a toast about legacy and protecting what you've built, stood in front of me and said very quietly, "I called you sweet and told my son's new mother-in-law how nice it was that you made the drive." I had no idea who I was speaking to. I told her that was all right. I hadn't corrected her because I didn't come here to be known. I came here to watch my daughter get married. It was Claire who found us a few minutes later, weaving through guests with a worried look, clearly having heard from someone that her new mother-in-law had pulled her mother aside. When she reached us, Regina turned to her and said in a voice that had lost all of its earlier polish, "Claire, dear, I think there's something about your mother you should know." And then in front of me, in front of Harold, still standing awkwardly with his folder, Regina explained briefly and carefully that the estate they were standing on, the fountain, the vineyard, the manor house Claire had just gotten married in front of, was held under a note owned by my family. That my name, not some stranger's, was the one on the paperwork that had kept this entire evening possible. I watched my daughter's face go through several emotions in the span of about 10 seconds. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then something that looked almost like fear, the particular fear of realizing you've drawn a map of someone using the wrong scale entirely. She looked at me and said, "Mom, is this true?" I told her it was. I told her Walter and I made that investment nearly a decade ago, quietly, the way we made most of our decisions, because we believed in helping families rebuild rather than letting land get carved up by strangers. I told her I never mentioned it because it never occurred to me it needed mentioning. It was simply one small piece of a life I'd built long before she needed to know the details. Claire's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I thought they were tears of realization, of shame for what she'd said to me hours earlier. But when she spoke, what came out was, "Why didn't you tell me? Do you understand what tonight could have been if I'd known?" And there it was, like the truest sentence she'd said to me all evening. Not an apology. A calculation of what she'd lost by not knowing sooner. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I simply told her that I understood completely now and that I would be leaving. I told her I loved her, and that love didn't require me to spend one more minute being told to make myself smaller in a room I could have, quite literally, ended the evening in with a single phone call. I told Regina Whitfield goodnight, thanked Harold for doing his job well, even at an inconvenient hour, and I walked to my car in the same navy dress I'd arrived in, pearls still on, exactly as invisible and exactly as unbothered as I'd been 3 hours earlier, except now, everyone in that tent understood precisely how much weight had been sitting quietly at table 14 all night. The drive home took 3 hours. I didn't cry until I was about 40 minutes from my own driveway, and even then, they weren't tears of anger. They were tears for the version of Claire I thought I'd raised. Someone who wouldn't need a folder of legal paperwork to remember that her mother deserved a seat at the head table, not because of what I owned, but because of who I was. In the weeks that followed, Claire called several times. The tone shifted each time. First, it was polite confusion, asking questions about Ashford Land Partners. I still can coupons, some out of habit and some because I genuinely enjoy a good deal on canned tomatoes. I still drive the same practical car. Nothing about who I am changed the night that folder opened in front of Regina Whitfield. What changed was who was allowed to see it. And I've decided that from now on, I get to choose who earns that, not the other way around. If you made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something. The way I always do at the end of these evenings, has anyone in your life ever asked you to shrink yourself so they wouldn't have to feel small standing next to you? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and more of you share these stories with me than you probably realize. If this one meant something to you, hit like so it reaches someone else who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe if you'd like to sit with me again for the next story. Until then, take care of yourselves and never apologize for the size of the life you quietly built. About how much we actually owned, about whether I'd ever consider restructuring things now that she was married into the Whitfield family. Then it became something closer to pleading. Regina had apparently grown cold toward her, treating her marriage into the family with new scrutiny now that the balance of power in the room had shifted, and Claire wanted to know if I would smooth things over with my new in-laws by way of marriage. I told her, gently but clearly, that I would not be renegotiating a 9-year-old business agreement to repair a relationship that should never have required negotiating in the first place. I did make one call about a month after the wedding. Not to Regina and not about the note. I called Harold, the property manager. I still can coupons, some out of habit and some because I genuinely enjoy a good deal on canned tomatoes. I still drive the same practical car. Nothing about who I am changed the night that folder opened in front of Regina Whitfield. What changed was who was allowed to see it. And I've decided that from now on, I get to choose who earns that, not the other way around. If you made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something. The way I always do at the end of these evenings, has anyone in your life ever asked you to shrink yourself so they wouldn't have to feel small standing next to you? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and more of you share these stories with me than you probably realize. If this one meant something to you, hit like so it reaches someone else who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe if you'd like to sit with me again for the next story. Until then, take care of yourselves and never apologize for the size of the life you quietly built.